Well, those of you who were here last night will know that we're looking at some chapters in the book of Revelation for these 3 evening studies. And tonight we turn to Revelation chapter 13. If you were here last night, you remember we were introduced by the Apostle John to a very remarkable picture, the Lamb at the center of the throne. In chapter 13, he presents us with another, altogether different picture, though it still has this idea of being an animal in it, an animal with horns, just like the lamb had horns. But as you will see, this is a very different kind of animal. I'm reading then from Revelation chapter 13, verse 1. I saw a beast coming out of the sea. He had 10 horns and 7 heads with 10 crowns on his horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was astonished and followed the beast. Men worshipped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshipped the beast and asked, "Who is like the beast? Who can make war against him?" The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies, and to exercise his authority for 42 months. He opened his mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. He was given power to make war against the saints and to conquer them. And he was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the book of life, belonging to the Lamb that was slain from the creation of the world. He who has ears, let him hear. If anyone is to go into captivity he will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword he will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints. Then I saw another beast coming out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. He exercised all the authority of the first beast on his behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. And he performed great and miraculous signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to earth in full view of men. Because of the signs he was given power to do on behalf of the first beast, he deceived the inhabitants of the earth. He ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. He was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that it could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. He also forced everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or on his forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. This calls for wisdom. If anyone has insight, let him calculate the number of the beast, for it is man's number. His number is 666. You could be forgiven for thinking this is a rather strange chapter to choose for a convention like this. It's certainly not safe territory, is it? But it's with considerable forethought I choose this particular chapter. Because, of course, this weekend is the weekend of the VE Day celebrations. We're being deluged on our television sets and in our newspapers with reminders of 50 years ago, and all that victory over the forces of fascism in Europe and in East Asia, all that meant. Seems to me it would be inappropriate if we let that occasion pass without some Christian reflection. And this seems to me to be a chapter that speaks with peculiar authority and relevance on that score. The Bible, you see, is a political book. I'm afraid not all Christians treat it as such. In fact, I've met quite a few Christians who want to lock politics in a box well out of reach of the church and the Bible. And if the pastor dares to raise the subject in the pulpit, well, he better look to his salary. But the Bible is a political book. If you were here last night, I hope you were able to see that that vision of the Lamb who was slain is a very political vision. At least it was when it was first given, when it was heard by those first Christians. And this beast here, you see, is in many ways a parody on that initial vision. This is not a lamb, this is a beast. He has horns too, even more horns than the lamb. He too was slain. He has a wound, a fatal wound from which he has been healed. And he too is worshipped. But the throne which he sits upon is not the throne of God. It's the throne of the dragon. On the day after an election in this country, in which there's been something of a sea change, it's perhaps important to remind ourselves that the Bible does not assess politics in the categories of right or left that we tend to use. The Bible knows nothing of our Conservative Party or our Socialist Party. Such equivalent terms just aren't to be found in the Bible. Because when the Bible assesses politicians, it assesses their spiritual alignment, either on the side of God or against him. It's the purpose, I think, of Revelation 13 to warn us that in the last days, that is, the days between Christ's first coming and his return in glory, the church must expect periods when godless politics are manifested in particularly vicious forms. In the opening verses of chapter 13, John is giving us some of the characteristics of such godless politics. I saw a beast coming out of the sea. He had 10 horns and 7 heads with 10 crowns on his horns, and each head a blasphemous name. Now, if you know your Bible, as I know many of you here will do, you'll be aware, I'm sure, that in the book of Romans, chapter 13, the Apostle Paul reflects on the proper function of government. He says the proper job of government is to reflect the just rule of God in society. There's nothing essentially dirty about politics. According to Romans 13, it's perfectly possible for political power to be exercised in a way that pleases God. That is why God has placed civil authority on earth. It is God who instituted it in order that his moral law might be maintained in a fallen world. So Paul says in Romans 13 that government is God's servant for the good of all men. At least that's how it's meant to be. Indeed, that's how it proved to be sometimes in Paul's experience, didn't it? On several occasions, he was rescued from the mob, for instance, from Jewish opponents who wanted to murder him, to lynch him. And he was rescued by the timely intervention of Roman justice. But Paul himself is aware that that happy situation wouldn't last forever. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, for instance, he speaks of a time of rebellion that is coming, a man of lawlessness, a man of anarchy, who will set himself up against God, who will not be a servant of God at all. And what John is doing here is describing for us here, in terms of his symbolism, of which the book of Revelation is so full, this personification of anti-Christian tyranny, which Paul anticipates there, and which the early Christians often called the Antichrist. Anti because he is against Jesus, but anti also because in a strange way he is a substitute, an antitype of Jesus. Just like this beast is an antitype, a substitute for the Lamb. See how he describes him from verse 2 onwards. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like a lion. Now that's a strange zoological hybrid, isn't it? What on earth is John doing with this bizarre imagery? Well, it's not to be visualized exactly. Try and visualize it, you get a very odd picture in your mind. This is to be decoded. Back in the Old Testament, Daniel was given a very important vision, not of one beast, but of 4. The first like a lion, the second like a bear, the third like a leopard, and the fourth a hideously powerful carnivore, unlike any beast Daniel knew. It's quite clear that what Daniel saw there, what he was representing, were 4 successive world empires. He's more or less told so. Perhaps the Babylonian, the Persian, the Greek, the Roman. Now, what John has done here, you see, in the case of his beast in Revelation 13, is to fuse these 4 symbolic animals of Daniel chapter 7 together, to make of them one composite monster. So what we have, in other words, here is the sum total of all the godless tyrannies the world has ever known. A composite picture of that. Now, no doubt for John, this beast represented Rome, the imperial power that was in charge of things in his day and which was persecuting the Christians in his day. If we had lived back in the Middle Ages, many of our Christian friends would have interpreted this beast as Islam, a force which at one time was sweeping towards Europe and at once conquered almost the whole of Spain. Christians in Europe were terrified of Islam and identified this beast with that anti-Christian power in the Middle Ages. In the time of Martin Luther, there were not a few Christians who identified this beast with the papacy. And of course, in more recent times, there have been an awful lot of Christians who've identified this beast with communism prior to its fall. Anyway, what a lot of good Christian books on the last days have fallen with the fall of communism. And even more recently, of course, I have some friends who are quite convinced the beast here is the European community, or what it's going to turn into very soon, if we don't put a stop to it. Well, the truth is, of course, that the beast is, well, at least Rome, and maybe Islam and the papacy and communism. He's all these kinds of anti-Christian powers. Yeah. For the beast is the archetype of godless politics in every age. Notice whose image he bears. 10 horns and 7 heads. Now, the significance of that is that is exactly the appearance of the dragon, which was encountered back in chapter 12, verse 13 and following. That dragon, or verse 3 of chapter 12, you'll see his 7 heads and 10 horns are mentioned, and his 7 crowns on his heads. This dragon, in chapter 12, John specifically identifies in verse 9 of chapter 12 as the ancient serpent called devil or Satan, who leads the world astray. So we know who the dragon is. And this beast bears the dragon's image. Indeed, it is that very same dragon who you see in verse 1 stands on the seashore at the commencement of John's vision here and beckons this infernal colleague of his up from the abyss. It is that very same dragon whom we read in verse 2 of chapter 13 empowers the beast with the authority he wields. So this beast, you see, represents government, represents empire, but not government reflecting the just rule of a sovereign God, a la Romans 13. This is government in its demonic perversion. This is what government becomes when the devil gets his hands on it. This is a picture for us of spiritual evil incarnate in structures of human political power. It is, if you like, an earthly manifestation of those spiritual principalities and powers in the heavenly realms which Paul says we must wrestle with. Notice the 3 characteristics John provides us with by which this beast can be recognized. First, invincibility. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. In other words, this beast seems to have an uncanny way of re-emerging even when you think you've beaten him. Now, to the Christians in the first century, I suspect this called to mind a myth which was very popular towards the end of the first century, that Nero, that terrible emperor who had begun the persecution business of the Christians, that Nero had never really committed suicide, and that he would one day return, that he would come back, perhaps from the dead, or perhaps he'd never really died. And certainly in the experience of the church, it seemed that no sooner had they lost one persecuting emperor than they found another. Nero was scarcely a memory before Domitian was on the throne in Rome, issuing orders of persecution against the Christians just as Nero had done. And so the troubles went on. To us, perhaps in the 20th century, this invincibility is a commentary on the way in which so often revolutionary change in politics simply results in a worse tyranny than the one the revolution was supposed to overthrow. I mean, we lose the Tsar and gain Lenin. Sure, the Russians appreciated that change. We lose the Kaiser and gain Hitler. Germany certainly appreciated that change, no doubt. We lose colonial oppression in the Third World and gain Marxist oppression in its stead. In his book Darkness at Noon, Arthur Koestler, the novelist, relates the story of an old Bolshevik who fought the good fight of Marxism in Russia, only to find in the hour of victory that he himself had been arrested as a, quote, enemy of the people. So often is true, isn't it, that the beast is wounded but always seems to be healed, for he has demonic recuperative power. Perhaps what John is trying to get us to see here is that you cannot defeat the beast by force of arms. And that's something we need to reflect on as we recall VE Day. Oh yes, it was a victory. The forces of a most godless regime were humbled and broken. And Europe rightly rejoiced in that. But we must not think that the power of the devil to pervert worldly politics was broken on VE Day 50 years ago. We must not think that because Hitler committed suicide, any more than the fact that Nero committed suicide, that the troubles of the church are over. No, at best, all you can achieve by force of arms is a brief respite from tyranny, and often you don't even achieve that. You can be sure the beast will be back, uglier than ever. And that brings me to the second characteristic I want you to notice that John says the beast has. Not just invincibility, but popularity. The whole world was astonished and followed the beast. Men worshipped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, but they also worshipped the beast and asked, who is like the beast? Who can make war against him? Now, I doubt whether there's any greater political mirage than the illusion that somehow democracy is a cast iron barrier against the abuse of power. We are very naive about this, you know. I wish democracy were as great as people crack it up to be, but unfortunately it isn't. You can't fool all the people all the time. That's what Abraham Lincoln said, didn't he? Well, I'm afraid he grossly underestimated the beast. What does John tell us? The whole world was astonished and followed the beast. People, you see, are neither as astute nor as upright as our democratic idealism would have us believe. People are quite capable of voting the beast into office. In fact, I hope you realize that Hitler was voted into office by the German people. One of the astonishing ironies of 20th century politics is the way that our obsession with elections has actually legitimized the rule of tyrannical individuals and tyrannical parties who thereafter dignify their regimes with the title democratic republics. I've lived in a few democratic republics briefly, and I can tell you There's nothing democratic about them. But they had elections. And the fact is, people admire might. And they will worship Satan and his allies in exchange for military security. That's what it's all about, isn't it? Who is like the beast? Who can make war against him? People are always far more concerned to save their skins, or perhaps to save their bank balances, than they ever are to save their souls. They would far rather appease a Hitler than resist him. But that brings me to the third and most important characteristic of this beast I want you to notice as we reflect on Revelation 13 in the light of VE Day. Not just his invincibility, not just his popularity. I want you to notice the totalitarian nature of his rule. Men worshipped the dragon, but they also worshipped the beast. And look down at verse 8. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast. I want you to notice that word, worship. It's a lovely story of a few years ago in the Houses of Parliament when Lord Hailsham was Chancellor. And on one occasion, there was a party of American tourists being shown around the House of Commons by an MP who had arranged the tour for them. And as they were coming down one of the corridors of the House of Commons being shown around, Lord Hailsham appeared from a side door in all his regalia as the Lord Chancellor. Very splendid he looked. As he looked down the corridor over the heads of the American tourists, he saw Neil Kinnock, who was then the leader of the opposition. And he wanted to attract his colleagues' attention. So he raised a hand and he said, "Neil!" Whereupon all the American tourists fell to one knee. Now we find that ludicrous, because the idea of worshipping political power today seems ludicrous to us. And perhaps it's just as well. Perhaps it's just as well that we do not lionize our political leaders too much. It is a dangerous thing when leaders of nations get too much honor from their people. The mark of the beast is that he demands worship and gets it. This is a clue, I think, to the beast's identity. See, governments can be militarily powerful and not be demonic. Governments can be popular without being demonic. But the characteristic of the beast that always gives him away is this attitude of total obeisance, total obedience, which he demands from his citizens. He is not satisfied that men, to quote Peter, fear God and honor the king, in that order. No, he wants total and unconditional submission of the will. In a word, he wants worship. You can identify two quite distinct theories of government, down through history. Maybe it's worth just tangentially commenting on them for a moment. On the one hand, you can observe in history what you might call the constitutional model of government. Those of you who are interested in the history of ideas, this is an idea that goes back to a man called John Locke at the beginning of the 18th century. On this view, the state exists to serve the interests of the individual. And one of the ways that is often ensured is that a constitution is written which defines the rights of individuals, which the state must defend and which it can never in the nature of things contradict. Such a constitutional government, you see, feels itself accountable to some higher law than itself. It can't make arbitrary decrees. It can only govern in accordance with these absolute principles of justice that are enshrined in the Constitution. That, I say, is one model. On the other hand, there is what you might call the totalitarian model of government. And those of you interested in the history of ideas may be aware that that goes back to a man called Hegel, a German philosopher. as well as perhaps Rousseau, a French philosopher in the 18th century. On this view, each citizen abdicates his or her individualistic goals for the superior good of society as a whole. The state is viewed as having almost got a will of its own, a general will, a collective will, as if the state was a living organism with a life of its own. And this general will, this collective will of the state, legitimately overrules the private consciences of any individual within it. Such absolute government is above the law. Now, of course, it was precisely this kind of totalitarian model which was characteristic of fascism in Europe 50 years ago. So, to quote Mussolini, fascism sees the state as an absolute, in comparison with which all individuals or groups are relative. Hans Frank, speaking of Hitler's Germany, our constitution is the will of the Führer. Very, very significant thing to say. Our constitution is the will of the Führer. Citizens of a state like that may perform any kind of atrocity and yet be immune from a sense of moral responsibility for it, because they were simply following the government's orders, the general will, like limbs of a body unquestionably performing the dictates of the brain. Now, at the risk of oversimplifying things, I'm prepared to argue those two types of government are in the Bible. In fact, they're in the Old Testament. Constitutional government and totalitarian government represent in political theory what Romans 13 and Revelation 13 represent in biblical theology. Government as God wills it, government as Satan perverts it. The archetype example of the totalitarian state in the Old Testament was Egypt, where the will of Pharaoh was obeyed as if it was the will of God. He was worshipped by the Egyptians. He was treated as a god, and God's people were enslaved under Pharaoh as a result, as they always are when the beast is on the throne. The archetypal model of constitutional government in the Old Testament is Israel, with David its king, who according to Deuteronomy could make no laws at all, but only enforce the national constitution, the law of God, of which he was the custodian. He was to sit on his throne and read his Bible and do what it said. That's what the king was there for in the Old Testament in Israel. See, in the Bible, political liberty is not a question of monarchy versus democracy. It's not a question of privileged elites versus universal franchise or anything like that. The way in which a political leader is selected is of really very little interest to the Bible. For the vital thing is how that political leadership perceives itself and is perceived by the people. That's the key thing. The mark of the beast is that he demands worship, absolute political power, answerable to no one but itself. The deified state. In verses 5 and 6, John is acknowledging that one of the first pictures of this bestial form of government, which he's drawing on here, occurs in that book of Daniel. Daniel perhaps was speaking most directly about a guy called Antiochus Epiphanes, who was a godless tyrant, who sought to destroy the holiness of God's temple in 150 years or so just before Jesus came, and who became a sort of model of what godless tyrants are like for God's people ever afterwards. In verses 5 and 6, there are very direct references back to that time of Antiochus, which Daniel speaks about. But John, of course, writing 200 years later, can see the Roman Empire here. For Julius Caesar abolished the Republican constitution of Rome and made it an absolute dictatorship. And ever after that stupid move on Julius Caesar's part, the emperors became increasingly arrogant. They thought of themselves increasingly as divine. Domitian, the emperor who was probably on the throne when Revelation was being written, went so far as to demand that men address him as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. No wonder John speaks of the beast uttering proud words and blasphemies. But it's important for us to realize in our 20th century that the beast doesn't have to use religious vocabulary like that in order to give expression to this deification of political power which he represents. As long as the obedience which the state receives is as unquestioning and as unconditional as that, as long as the authority of the state is absolute, acknowledging no constitutional limits, then what exactly the beast calls itself is irrelevant. The state is playing God. The state is demanding that people must worship the state. The mark of the beast is that people give to the state that unconditional and total allegiance which rightly belongs to God alone. Military might, mass popularity, totalitarian rule. It's not hard, is it, to see the marks of 50 years ago in that. I suppose the question we want to ask is, how on earth do people fall for it? I mean, surely this kind of tyrannical system can only be sustained by coercion of a very brutal kind. But John is shrewd enough to realize that isn't so. People voluntarily submit to the beast's authority in their masses. No one who has seen films of those adulating crowds before Hitler in the 1930s can doubt that John is right in his insight here. Now that brings us really to the second beast in verses 11 and following, which John describes for us. I want you to look at that one too. Then I saw another beast coming out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. He exercised all the authority of the first beast on his behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast. Now, what's John talking about here? Well, if you look on to chapter 19, verse 20, you'll find this second beast is called the false prophet. And that is really a clue to his identity. If the beast from the sea, the first beast, represents the totalitarian state, this beast from the earth represents the state religion or the state ideology or the state machinery that bolsters that regime and persuades people to yield their allegiance to it. That's what this second beast does. Now, I've no doubt for John's contemporaries, this second beast was interpreted as the emperor cult, the religion, the ceremonial that went along with this worship of the emperor. It was impressive and utterly pagan, of course, in its hocus pocus, but it was immensely popular. A later generation of Protestant martyrs, of course, identified this second beast, this false prophet, with Catholicism, the religion that kept the papacy in its position of political influence in Europe. Maybe for us today it's a bit more difficult to identify what this second beast represents. For of course in the last couple of centuries in the West we've tried very hard to sever religion from politics, haven't we? With our desire for toleration that motivated it. Peace can only be maintained, we said, if you keep religion out of politics, so we tried. In America they excluded religion, politics, or separated politics and religion by law in the Constitution. In England, of course, a sentimental attachment to the Church of England prevented us from doing that. But with a typical sort of British compromise, we made sure the bishops were consigned to a convenient corner of political impotence called the House of Lords. Either way, what emerged in the 18th century was the so-called secular state. Politics with no religious banner to wave any longer. Politics that wasn't Protestant, wasn't Catholic. Politics that was secular. At least that's what it was supposed to be. But of course, what has happened actually in those 2 or 3 centuries since that is not that religion has been banished from our politics at all, but that a new and godless religion has grown up to inform the political enterprise instead. Humanism, in all its various shapes and forms. Fascism was a form of humanism. Marxism was a form of humanism. Capitalism and socialism, which dominate in the democratic countries of the West, they too have their roots in humanism. These systems of thought may not use religious terminology, but in all sorts of ways they fulfill religious functions, because they provide us with a worldview, and they shape our value system for us. These are our 20th century ideological counterparts of the official Roman religion of John's day. These are the ideologies, these are the philosophies, these are the systems of ideas by which the false prophets of our 20th century totalitarianism have tried to rationalize and defend their schemes. John gives us some useful insights into the sorts of techniques that the false prophet always uses. In verse 11, you see, it's a deceptive public image. He had 2 horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. He had a veneer, even, of something that Christians maybe ought to be sympathetic to. Well, he was religious, wasn't it? It was religion, this Roman cult. But he spoke like a dragon. The demonic was in what was said, what it meant in the words. But on the outside, you could be deceived. He looked harmless, looked respectable, looked religious, maybe. But what was actually spoken, the ideas that were being communicated, were pernicious. Do you know, there are a great many books on the shelves in the library in Cambridge, where I come from, that fall straight into this category. They look harmless on the outside, but the ideas they contain are demonic. The ideology of the beast, you see, always has to work hard on its PR. Where you're as ugly as the beast is, you need a front man. You need a nice picture on the front cover of the paperback. It needs to look innocent and appealing. That brings us to the second technique that this false prophet uses. Look at verses 13 to 14. We'd call this, I think, propaganda, the propaganda campaign. He performs great and miraculous signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to earth in full view of men. And because of the signs he was given power to do on behalf of the first beast, notice, he deceived the inhabitants of the earth. Get that? An impressive display of power. Perhaps in an unsophisticated age, it might be a supernatural display, conjured by magic. In an age like ours, a secular age, where the supernatural tends to be disdained, until fairly recently anyway, maybe it's the miracles of modern technology which take its place to convince people. But whichever way it is, the public is convinced by the signs which the ideology of the beast is able to perform, that the beast can really deliver the goods. He can solve the energy crisis. He can equip the army. He can revive the economy. Vote for the beast. And that brings you to the third technique he uses. You notice not just a deceptive public image and a propaganda campaign, but also tied in with that, the cult of personality. At the end of verse 14, he ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. He was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast so that it could speak, and caused all who refused to worship the image to be killed. Now, this is one of the most fascinating features of totalitarian government in every age. It always seems to need a face. People can't worship a political theory, you see. Ideas are important. But if a political party wants to gain the total and unconditional obeisance of a people, it must have some kind of charismatic leader, some dynamic person whose face can be projected and around whom loyalty can focus. In the Roman Empire, of course, it was the emperor. They made statues of the emperor, and you found them everywhere. Every street corner, there was a statue of Caesar for you to worship and admire. In more recent days, of course, there were those gigantic wall posters. They had them in Russia, didn't they, in Stalin's day. They had them in Nazi Germany, great posters of Mussolini and Hitler. And in China, too, of Mao, of course. But perhaps most recently of all, it's television, isn't it? Which brings the image of the leader into our homes. The leader must be good on the box, for now indeed the beast's image can come alive and talk to people. Never before has false prophecy achieved such an intimate and effective method of propagating the personality cult of the beast. It's almost irresistible. And all over the world it's being used. I've absolutely no desire to make any comment on the recent election we've had in this country. But I will tell you something which just disturbed me a little bit. On East Anglian television last week, they were interviewing some people about their intentions, who they were going to vote for. And of course, a great many people said they were going to vote Labour. And they asked one nice old lady in the shopping centre in Bury St Edmunds or somewhere who she was going to vote for, and she said she was going to vote Labour. And they asked her why, and she said, "Oh, but you see, Mr. Blair has such a nice smile." Now, actually, he does have a very nice smile, and I'm far from being hostile to Mr. Blair. But I tell you this, it will be a bad day for Britain if we start electing our prime ministers on the basis of how well they smile on TV. Perhaps Hitler had a nice smile. He must have had a nice something for so many people to worship him. There are always those, of course, who don't submit to the brainwashing of the propaganda, who aren't fooled by the deceptive public image and the personality cult. For those people, there are the old-fashioned techniques, cruder but still effective. All who refused to worship the image, he killed. The reign of terror, then. Once failure to conform to political orthodoxy becomes a criminal or even a capital offence, you really know the beast is in the driving seat in the country. Or there's the starve them into submission technique, isn't there? He also forced everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or on his forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. Of all the characteristics of the ideology of the beast, this is perhaps the most disconcerting to a modern audience, because of what John is describing for us here in verses 16 and 17 is the bureaucratic control of the economy. Without permission from the beast, you cannot earn your daily bread. You're not allowed to trade without submission to the beast. The beast not only holds the reins of political and military power, he monopolizes the marketplace too. That is worrying. At least it worries me. I sometimes wonder if socialists, with all their talk about nationalism and centralizing economic power, understand what a political beast that sometimes creates. Equally, I sometimes wonder if capitalists, with their vast corporations, always growing through mergers and takeovers and the like, realize what a beast they could be creating. Modern governments, with their huge computers, processing men and women by social security numbers, income tax numbers and the like. More and more people are controlled today. No one may buy or sell without the mark, without the number. Sometimes you see this Leviathan can grow even within the structures of constitutional government without us realizing it. Whether it be capitalistic big business politics or socialistic big brother politics. We need to be aware of thinking, that the beast is the red menace. Well, there isn't a red menace any longer, is there? No, sometimes in my worst nightmares, I imagine the beast being voted in by the moral majority. There is a certain appeal, in totalitarian government for Christians. Christians who want law and order. Christians who are concerned to see that People do as they're told, and there's a sense of duty and control. Look at South Africa, for instance. The appeal of that regime to Christians for decades worries me. The beast may be closer to us than we think, because you see, this false ideology of the false prophet is immensely clever and sophisticated and subtle, and it may impregnate our minds without us even realizing it, and soften us up for the beast. And that brings me to the last thing I want you to think about from this chapter, the central verses from verses 9 to 10. What should our Christian response to such godless politics be? Oh, it's comparatively easy for us when you have a Romans 13 situation, a just government which reflects the just rule of God, which you can honor with a clear conscience, and which will defend the right of the Church of Jesus Christ to meet and to preach. But what about when the beast usurps the throne? What about when the devil is in the driving seat, as he was for these early Christians and is for many of our brothers and sisters around the world? What do you do then? What if that were to happen again in Europe? What if it were to happen in our country? How would we react? I mentioned earlier that one of the characteristics of the last couple of centuries has been our attempt to separate religion and politics in the name of toleration. Most of us, I guess, have imbibed that idea of keeping religion and politics apart with our mother's milk. That's why we don't like the preacher to talk about politics in the pulpit. Somehow isn't right. That's why we find it so hard to understand someone like Khomeini in Iran. That's why even someone like Ian Paisley in Northern Ireland bewilders many English people. He seems so incomprehensibly unenlightened and reactionary to make a political issue of our religious preferences. Why can't they just live and let live, we say, don't we? Well, I don't think in any way I'm endorsing Khomeini or even Ian Paisley. But I have to say to you this evening that it isn't quite as straightforward as that. Of course, it may be very convenient to keep religion and politics in watertight compartments. And there may be some religions which are quite content with such an arrangement, quite happy that they should be part of our private lives, something we do at home on our own, and nothing more. But Christianity simply can't acquiesce to that. And the reason for that is quite simple. The fundamental tenet of our Christian faith is Jesus Christ is Lord. Not just my Lord, as if his dominion were restricted to the private life of a Christian believer. No, our confession is Jesus Christ is Lord, the unqualified and universal King of everything and everybody. He is the Lamb upon the throne. If men are ignorant of his rule, they must be told. That's evangelism. That's why we have the right to do it, because he is Lord. If men reject his rule, they must face the consequences. That is judgment. And nobody is exempt. And I suggest to you that such a creed is bound to have political implications. The Roman Empire was quite right to see Christianity as a treasonable offense. For so long as the Emperor of Rome made himself God, Christianity had to be a treasonable offense. There was no way Christians could witness to their Lord and not practice civil disobedience. Equally, the Kremlin was right in the days when communism was still a great force behind the Iron Curtain. It was quite right to be anxious about the growing number of Baptist and Pentecostal churches, for it represented a threat to the political muscle of that essentially atheistic, totalitarian regime. This is not because, you see, Christians have any political program or any military muscle or might, not at all. But simply that confession, Jesus Christ is Lord. That confession exposes to public gaze the illegitimacy of the beast. The moment you have said it, Jesus Christ is Lord, you have placed an enormous qualifier on the authority of any political force the world may know. Wherever the beast sets up his throne, Jesus Christ is Lord, topples him off it. There is a higher allegiance. There is a greater authority. That's why constitutional government is the only sort of government a Christian can feel happy with, one which acknowledges the higher law of God. That is the truth. And it is the truth the liar fears. So in particular, you see, there is no way Christianity can ever surrender to totalitarianism without denying to Christ that proper authority in the civil sphere which our confession of his lordship demands. That's why the Roman Empire persecuted the Christians, because they would insist Jesus Christ is Lord, and they refused point blank to say Caesar is Lord. That is why the beast has always persecuted the church. If Christianity were a religion that could keep its nose out of politics, it would be safe. But it can't. Authentic Christianity has to be politically aware. Everybody else may surrender their will to the totalitarian state. Everybody else may cast a blind eye to the beast and what he's doing. But the Christian cannot. For he knows the rule of the beast is illegitimate. He is a usurper of a throne that belongs to Christ. Oddly enough, that is almost certainly the significance of that cryptic number, 666. I know you're waiting for me to get to that verse. Enormous quantities of ink, of course, have been spent trying to work out what it means. Almost certainly, it's an example of what's called gematria. In the Greek language, and also in the Hebrew language, actually, they didn't have a separate system of numbers. Letters of the alphabet also had a numerical value, which meant that you could add up the numerical value of somebody's name. Your name, for instance, would have a numerical total if you added up the numerical value of the letters of your name. There's a rather popular and interesting example of it in Pompeii, which was covered with the volcano Vesuvius when it went up. They found a little inscription there on a tree which was carved, "I love her whose number is 545. Very romantic. So much more romantic than just carving initials. So much more intriguing to work out. Oh, I wonder who that could be. Let's work out all the girls' numbers and see which one is 545. So is 666 then some cryptic representation of maybe the Roman emperor's number? Well, it would be nice if it worked out nice and easily. Unfortunately, it doesn't. That's probably why John says this calls for wisdom. It's a little bit more difficult than that. Some people suggested maybe it was Nero's name worked out in numbers, but unfortunately you can only get it to come to 666 if you spell it in Hebrew and make a spelling mistake, so that's not terribly convincing. Now, my opinion from what it's worth, and I'll stick with it until somebody comes up with a better idea, that this isn't a strictly gematria at all. It's a symbolic number. You see, if you work out the gematria value of Jesus' name, it comes to 888. And there are some early Christian books that actually point this out. And it is quite possible, I think, that the early Christians persecuted in Rome used the number 888 as a kind of code for their master's name. Keep them safe. They weren't saying anything politically subversive when they spoke about 888. Well, maybe the number of the beast, 666, is simply a comment on the inferiority of the beast to Jesus. Remember, he is the Antichrist. He's the one who tries so hard to look like the lamb on the throne, but never quite can because he's so ugly. His number isn't 888, he's not even 777. No, his is the number of a man, says John. 666, that's his number. Close, but not right. It's a sort of arithmetic way of blowing a raspberry at the beast without actually committing treason. Well, that's my theory anyway. Whether it's right or not, you must judge. The point is this. John insists that these Christians have a spiritual responsibility to stand against the beast, to identify the illegitimacy of his rule and stand against him. You can't separate religion from politics into your private life, he's telling these Christians. You must identify yourself publicly as one who will not wear the mark of the beast, but who bears instead the secret seal of God's elect. How are Christians to do that? How are they to make their protests known? Well, how they are not to make it, of course, is to take up arms against the emperor. It's very possible, I think, that verse 10 is a comment on precisely that. If anyone is to go into captivity he will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword he will be killed. This is a reminder of Jesus' insistence of non-violence to his disciples just before the cross when they wanted to take a sword. Whoever takes the sword will be killed by the sword, he told them. The church is not empowered by the master to take up arms, not even against the beast, not as the church. That's not to say that the secular state may not do so, as in the last war. But Christians witness to a much different way of standing against the beast. What does the church do? What can the church do as the church when the beast is on the throne? She can do, says John, only one thing. She can suffer. That is Jesus' way. That is the way of the Lamb who was slain. If anyone is to go into captivity he will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword he will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints. There are times, you see, when the only place a Christian can retain his or her integrity is in prison or on the scaffold. Have you ever thought that your Christianity might cost you that? It's no wonder our churches are so full, is it? We never mention that, do we? Takes nerve. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints. There surely has never been in our century a more embarrassing failure in the church than that which was exhibited by the churches of Germany in the days of Hitler's rise to power. Many Christians, of course, in Germany later bitterly repented of their silence. I remember reading Pastor Niemöller's tragic confession. He said, first the Nazis came for the handicapped and the insane, and I said nothing. Then they came for the homosexuals, and I said nothing. Then the Nazis came for the Jews, and I said nothing. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to say anything. Why were they silent? Why did they allow themselves to be compromised in that way? The Church of Luther had resisted the tyranny of the Pope. Why did it capitulate to the tyranny of Nazism? And I think the honest truth has to be there was a most disastrous failure of nerve. Many of our Christian brothers and sisters in Germany before the war had projected the reign of Christ into some future millennial age. They had abandoned politics. For some, their Christian experience had degenerated into a mere orgy of religious sentimentality. They sang lots of songs in the cave, like the prophets in Elijah's day. There were all too few willing to stand up on Mount Carmel and resist the prophets of Baal. And still others where they had abandoned the divine authority of the Bible. Critical theories of the Bible had undermined their trust in God's word. At best, Christianity in Germany in the 1930s had retreated into pietism. At worst, it had surrendered to skepticism and secularism. It wasn't the virile, red-blooded Christianity of the early church which cooperated so meekly with the Nazis. It was an enfeebled and emasculated and an anemic weakling. And it must never happen again. It must never happen again. But I fear it could. How do we Christians react when the threat of the beast starts to raise his ugly head? Some of us are chameleons, aren't we? We change our political colour to match the beast. I've heard more than been to one conference where people were trying to persuade me that Jesus was really a Marxist. There are others of us who adopt the porcupine defence, don't we? We roll ourselves into a prickly ball. We are no threat to anybody, provided we're left alone. And most of us, I guess, are ostriches. Just put our head in the sand and hope it will all go away. Now, Christians should be lions roaring in the night. That's how Amos, of course, that's the metaphor he uses for his prophetic ministry, a lion roaring. That's how the church should be. It grieves my heart that our political vigilance is so tame. It was Edmund Burke, wasn't it, who said that the triumph of evil requires nothing more than this, that good men do nothing. We cannot say the Bible is silent on this question. We cannot say it hasn't told us that in the last times there will come times of stress. In the last times, persecution will become the norm, and often, because instead of the just government of God reflected in the civil authority, we shall find the demonic power of Satan represented there, and all his malice against the church will find an outlet. Perhaps the real problem is we're not willing to suffer. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints. Let's pray quietly together, and then Jeff will lead us in a closing song.